There is a moment when the night first reaches you, quiet on the outside, but carrying a subtle motion inside your mind. It's a motion that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, doesn't even call your name directly. It simply exists, soft, persistent, almost shy, yet unmistakably present. It's the moment when thoughts that stayed quiet all day begin to gather, not loudly, but with the kind of presence that asks to be noticed without insisting on anything. You may not even realize when it happens. One moment, the world is fading into its evening stillness. The next, you sense something moving within you, a faint stir, a quiet shift, a tiny ripple of awareness that sits just beneath the surface. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy, just the first trace of a thought that isn't ready to rest, even though the night has already begun. There is no urgency in it, only a small awareness that the mind has its own timing. It doesn't follow the clock. It doesn't follow the body. It turns inward on its own rhythm, drifting into focus in a way that feels neither sudden nor slow, just natural, familiar, quietly alive. This opening moment has a tenderness to it, almost like a soft murmur you can sense but not fully hear. Not a sound, not an image, not a memory. Simply a feeling of something alive in the background of your thoughts. A presence that has been there all along, but didn't need your attention until the world around you softened enough for you to notice. The night amplifies this, not by adding weight, but by removing the noise that used to drown it out. Everything external becomes gentler, and in that gentleness, your inner layers rise with more clarity. You don't call them. They come on their own. They breathe at their own pace. They settle and unsettle, creating a quiet rhythm that belongs only to you. You might feel a subtle shift as your mind begins to uncoil from the day. Not a release, but a loosening. Not a decision, but an unfolding. Almost as if the mind is reshaping itself after holding so much during the hours before this one. Thoughts stretch a little. Some come closer. Some drift to the edges. Some hover in between. They don't form lines or stories. They simply exist in their raw, unorganized form. There is something gentle in letting them be exactly as they are, not pushing them away, not pulling them closer, just noticing the way they linger in the quiet, the way they rest on the surface of your awareness without fully sinking in. The night gives them that space, the space to exist, without needing to resolve the space to breathe without being questioned. In this first layer of nighttime awareness, your thoughts aren't heavy. They're simply awake. Awake in a way that feels different from daytime awake. They don't have shape, and they don't have urgency. They're like the first movements of water before a tide fully rises, soft, faint, almost transparent. They drift in and out of your attention as if they are testing the quiet. And you, in this moment, are not required to interpret them. You're not expected to understand why they're here. Nighttime doesn't ask for meaning. It only reveals what the mind had been holding without any pressure to do anything about it. There's something comforting in that. Something steady, even if it feels delicate. You might sense a quiet widening inside you, the kind that happens when the world starts to dim, and the internal world brightens just enough for you to see its outlines. Not too clearly, not sharply, just enough to feel the presence of something deeper behind your thoughts. A feeling that isn't loud, but isn't silent either. Somewhere gently in between. The night has always had this ability, this subtle way of softening the boundaries of the mind so that what lives underneath can rise without resistance. You don't force it, you don't guide it. You simply notice it, the way you might notice a faint shift in temperature or the smallest movement of air. Something that changes the atmosphere around you without calling attention to itself. These early thoughts, the ones that refuse to rest when the night begins, are often the most fragile. They come not to trouble you, but to be acknowledged in the quiet. A quiet that finally has room for them. A quiet that doesn't compete. A quiet that lets them exist without defining them. Sometimes, the mind seems to drift slightly forward as if reaching for something uncertain. Other times, it pulls slightly inward, gathering itself before loosening again. This soft rhythm isn't a problem. It's simply how the inner world moves when outer noise fades. A natural adjustment, a small alignment, a tiny shift in balance. You don't have to name what you feel. Some states of mind don't want names. They want space. Space to exist undefined. Space to breathe. Space to settle into the night without being shaped into something else. And as these early night thoughts move through you, a quiet understanding begins to form, not through explanation, but through presence alone. An understanding that the mind has textures you can only sense when everything else softens. An understanding that nothing is wrong with what arises in this moment. It's just the mind meeting the night in its own way. You may feel a subtle calm in simply allowing this, not because the thoughts disappear, but because they no longer need to. They don't ask for resolution. They don't demand clarity. They exist like a soft hum beneath your awareness, a murmur of the inner world settling into the evening's depth. There's something quiet, almost tender, in knowing that your thoughts don't have to rest right away. The night is long. Its stillness is patient. And your mind is allowed to arrive, slowly, arriving in its own time, drifting gently into the softer edges of itself. Nothing about this moment asks you to be different than you are. Nothing pulls you toward any direction. The night simply holds space. And in that space, the first quiet layer of your inner world unfolds soft, slow, unhurried, exactly the way it needs to. The quiet of the night has its own way of loosening what has been held tightly, and as you move a little deeper into it, you might sense how the mind begins revealing layers that stayed hidden during the day. Not because they were unwilling to appear, but because the daylight world is too full, too loud, too demanding for their softer presence to be felt. When night arrives, even without your intention, these layers rise not in waves, not in intensity, but in a quiet order that only darkness and stillness can create. There's something about the absence of noise around you that creates a different kind of presence within you. It doesn't rush forward. It doesn't push. It unfolds slowly, subtly, like something that has always been there, but finally has the room to breathe. You can feel it in the way your thoughts don't just appear. They rise with depth, carrying pieces of yourself you don't often meet. A faint murmur within, more felt than heard, letting you know that deeper layers are stirring. You may notice how the night doesn't erase anything. It doesn't empty the mind. Instead, it reveals. It pulls back a veil you didn't know you carried. The thoughts that lived underneath that veil aren't new. They aren't unfamiliar. They were simply quieter during the day, overshadowed by the constant movement around you. The night offers them a different space, a softer one, a space where they can sit without competing for attention. There is a gentleness in realizing that the mind works this way. It shifts into visibility what usually remains in the background. Feelings that drifted at the edges come closer. Questions that stayed silent make a slight movement inward. Memories that didn't ask to be recalled suddenly feel closer, not in detail, but in presence. Nothing sharp, nothing overwhelming, just a soft exposure of the inner layers that belong to you. As you feel this exposure, it becomes clear that it has nothing to do with weakness or intensity. It's simply part of the way the human mind responds to quiet. When the world dims, the internal world lights up in subtle ways, not bright, not loud, just enough for you to sense what has been waiting underneath your daytime thoughts. The kind of sensing that doesn't demand interpretation. It only asks to be recognized. You might feel the boundary between your thoughts and your emotions becoming thinner here, not merging, but resting closer together. The mind loosens, and in that loosening, some feelings drift into its space, carried in faint outlines. They don't define themselves. They don't introduce themselves. They simply hover, soft, blurred, familiar, in a way you can't quite explain. A presence that asks nothing of you except acknowledgement. There's a certain honesty in this part of the night, an honesty that doesn't rely on clarity or answers. It exists in the rawness of what surfaces in the quiet way your inner world reveals itself when the outside world stops asking you to be alert. It's an honesty that isn't loud. It doesn't confront. It unfolds like a slow breath, releasing what was held in the background. This is where the night exposes your inner layers, not in a dramatic unveiling, but in a subtle softening of the mind's protective cover. The thoughts that come forward aren't necessarily deep or meaningful. Some are fragments. Some are barely formed. Some don't belong to any category at all. But they carry a small truth. They matter simply because they are part of you. You may notice small movements in these thoughts, tiny shifts that feel like they're adjusting themselves in the quiet. Maybe a feeling that has been waiting for silence to be felt fully. Maybe a thought that has been whispered inside you long before the night arrived. Maybe a trace of something you didn't have space for earlier. The night helps bring these forward, not to overwhelm, but to honor their existence. There's no pressure in this process. You're not asked to follow the thoughts. You're not asked to understand them. The night doesn't require you to resolve anything. It simply asks you to witness, to be present with what rises, even when what rises is soft, blurry, incomplete. The value of these thoughts isn't in their clarity, it's in their presence. They show you the parts of yourself that only appear when everything else quiets down. In this space, you may feel how your mind isn't just thinking, it's feeling its way through your inner world. Each movement is delicate. Each thought carries a quiet texture. Even the fragments have a kind of weight, not heavy, but grounded. A sensation that reminds you that your inner world continues moving even when you're still, even when the night is calm, even when your body settles into rest. These layers don't rise to disturb you. They rise because nighttime gives them permission, and because in this soft dark, you can finally feel them without being pulled in too many directions. The mind's exposure isn't an event, it's a state, a gradual revealing that has always been part of your human rhythm. And somewhere beneath it all, that faint murmur inside continues, soft, persistent, not asking you to do anything, not guiding you, not shaping your thoughts. It simply marks the presence of your deeper self surfacing in the quiet, a sign that the night has begun its work, not to change you, but to show you what already lives beneath the surface. There's something steadying about this, something grounding, something that reminds you that you don't have to resist the inner layers rising now. This is what the night does. It lowers the world and raises your inner voice not to overwhelm, but to be felt, to be honored, to be gently acknowledged in the kind of stillness that only this moment can offer. And as you sense these layers continuing to reveal themselves, you realize there is nothing you need to chase, nothing you need to solve, and nothing you need to push away. The night is carrying you inward at its own pace, revealing what belongs to you with the softest possible touch. There is a particular softness that settles around you when the night is opened just enough for the deeper parts of your inner world to come closer, and yet not enough to feel overwhelming. It's the kind of softness that doesn't shield you from your thoughts, but cushions them, gives them space to unfold without becoming too sharp. This is the space where emotional safety begins, not as something you create, but as something that forms naturally when the noise outside has gone quiet. You may notice it in the way your mind stops leaning forward and settles just slightly inward. Not in a deliberate way, not as an act of control, but as a natural response to the quiet around you. The night carries an atmosphere that makes room for your inner world to sit without needing anything from you. And your thoughts, even the ones that linger restlessly, seem to sense this shift. They move differently here, slower, softer, less demanding. There is a gentleness in realizing that safety at night doesn't always come from what you do. Sometimes it comes from the simple fact that the world has stepped back far enough for you to breathe differently. When the world is less present, you become more present with yourself, not in a heavy or intense way, but in a subtle unfolding that feels like an inner door opening without a sound. The absence of pressure is part of what makes this space feel safe. There is no expectation on you to sort through anything, no urgency to categorize your thoughts, no need to untangle any emotions. The night doesn't ask for clarity. It doesn't ask for solutions. It only offers you a stillness where the parts of you that stayed quiet during the day can rise without fear of being too much. And you can feel that stillness in small ways, in the way your breath feels less structured, in the way your body doesn't try to hold itself the way it does during the day, in the way your inner world expands by just a little enough to feel the presence of something deeper, but not enough to ask you to meet it fully. Just enough for you to sense that you're not carrying everything alone. Even your thoughts feel like they're sitting with you rather than being placed on you. Sometimes this sense of safety comes not from the thoughts themselves, but from the space between them, the quiet intervals that feel like a soft pause in your internal movement, a kind of gentle widening that reassures you without saying anything. You feel it as a small, barely noticeable ease that moves through the mind, a subtle warmth, a slight settling that doesn't erase the noise but holds it in a softer outline. There is a faint murmur inside you, a subtle inner resonance that doesn't speak in words but in presence. It expands just enough to touch the edges of your awareness, reminding you that not everything inside you is restless. Some parts are simply trying to steady you in their own way, offering a quiet support you don't have to earn or maintain. A presence that doesn't instruct, doesn't direct, doesn't judge. It just exists next to your thoughts, like a soft companion. In this safety, your thoughts lose their sharpness. They become less like lines and more like contours, shapes you can feel without needing to define. Their movement becomes gentler, their presence more fluid. They stop pushing, stop crowding, stop demanding to be solved. They begin to hover in a space where they can exist without pressing against you. You might feel your mind shifting from a stance of holding to a stance of resting, not fully resting, not completely letting go, but resting enough to feel the difference, enough to feel the mind stop bracing, enough to feel your internal edges soften, enough to sense that there is room inside you for what the night brings without it becoming too much. There's something deeply human about this moment, something unspoken, quiet, familiar. It's the moment where you realize that nothing inside you is asking to be fixed right now. Your thoughts aren't asking to be managed. Your emotions aren't asking to be understood. Everything within you simply wants to exist in this soft, widened interior where nothing is required to change. And because nothing is required, you begin to trust the space a little more. You begin to feel how the night is not just a backdrop, but a gentle environment that supports your inner unfolding. It offers a stillness that doesn't silence you, but holds you. A place inside the quiet where even restless thoughts seem less threatening, less intense, less sharp. The safety here doesn't depend on resolving anything. It comes from the quiet understanding that you are allowed to feel what rises without having to shape it or name it. It comes from knowing that whatever drifts into your awareness has room to be here, that you don't have to push anything away or pull anything closer, that the night is wide enough to hold both your thoughts and the spaces between them. In this subtle openness, you may notice the faintest shift in your emotional rhythm, a soft slowing, a gentler pulse, a sense of interior warmth that doesn't spread outward but settles inward, grounding you in the kind of comfort that doesn't need to be explained. It's quiet, but it's real. It's small, but it's enough. And that quiet murmur inside you, the one that appeared earlier, begins to expand in the gentlest way. Not stronger, not louder, but clearer in its presence. A small inner signal that you're allowed to feel whatever rises next. That this moment doesn't require control. That this part of the night is meant for being, not doing. The night doesn't take away your thoughts. It simply softens the space they land in. It opens a gentle atmosphere where your inner world feels less scattered, less exposed, less vulnerable. You're not required to step deeper yet. You're only asked to rest in this early safety, the kind that allows your thoughts to unfold without fear of overwhelming you. And in that softness, you begin to recognize the rare truth of this moment. You are meeting yourself in a space that asks nothing of you. You are sitting with your mind not against it. You are resting inside a night that quietly protects your inner unfolding. Nothing more is needed here. Nothing more is asked. Just presence. Just quiet. Just this gentle beginning of emotional safety. There comes a moment in the night when the mind begins to show its true shape, not the version it held all day, not the quick thoughts that moved through you without pause, but the quieter ones that waited for stillness to make themselves known. It happens subtly, almost without your awareness. a slight tightening of attention, a faint shift in the background of your inner world, a small recognition that something inside you is more awake than the rest of you is. It isn't loud. It isn't intense. It isn't dramatic. It's simply present. The thoughts that arrive here do not introduce themselves. They drift forward the way a soft murmur rises from another room. No form, no edges, just presence. You don't see the whole of them. You don't need to. You sense them the way you sense quiet movement in the dark, through the feeling of something shifting, not through the clarity of its image. These thoughts are familiar in a way that doesn't need memory. They visited before, though not always in the same form. They appear when the world quiets and the mind no longer needs to protect itself from everything happening outside. Thoughts that hold small echoes of worries, fragments of unfinished questions, tiny loops of meaning that played in the background throughout the day, but never quite reached your attention. The night doesn't make them stronger. It makes them clearer. Not because they grow, but because everything else dims. You may notice how your mind begins to move in patterns, not chaotic ones, not heavy ones, but distinct enough to recognize. A thought comes, then its outline, then its residue, but none of it forms a story. It's more like a small rhythm beneath your awareness, a rhythm that has been there for a long time, just quiet enough that daylight distracted you from hearing it. This is the active mind at night, not overactive, not restless in the dramatic sense, simply awake. Awake in a way that responds to silence, to space, to an absence of noise. It stirs because there is finally room for it to move. And it moves gently at first, almost respectfully, as if testing whether the night is ready to hold what it carries. You might feel the mind opening a little wider here, not enough to reveal everything, but enough to sense that the surface thoughts have shifted aside. What rises now is softer, deeper, more subtle. Thoughts that linger, thoughts that hover, thoughts that hold a faint pulse of meaning without insisting you grasp them fully. They often begin as sensations rather than ideas. A slight pull in your attention, a drift towards something unspoken, a tiny shift in your focus that doesn't feel intentional but feels unmistakably internal. These movements are quiet, but they are real. They mark the beginning of deeper mental activity, the kind that surfaces because the night finally allows it to. There is something strangely comforting in recognizing this pattern, not because you regain control of your mind, but because you see its nature. The mind is not trying to disturb you. It's not trying to create noise. It's simply responding to stillness. During the day, it held itself tight. Now it loosens, releasing small pieces of itself into your awareness. Pieces that need space more than attention. Pieces that want to breathe more than they want to be solved. You may feel how your thoughts begin to move, in loops, not repetitive in a troubling way, but repeating enough that you recognize the shape of their presence. A question returning, but softer this time. A feeling drifting closer, but without pressure. A memory fragment appearing not as an image, but as a distant texture. A possibility rising, but without direction. These loops are not warnings. They are not signals for action. They are the natural rhythm of the mind adjusting to night. Everything inside you becomes more perceptible because everything outside becomes quieter. Your thoughts begin tracing gentle paths, looking for places to rest. Some settle quickly, some take their time, some hover in between, undecided but not intrusive. And through all of it, the faint murmur within you remains a quiet internal echo that accompanies your thoughts without pushing them anywhere. It's not a voice and not a message. It's simply the presence of your mind acknowledging its own movement, a soft awareness that your inner world is alive, responsive, shifting not to trouble you, but to find its way into the calm. There is something human in this moment, something universal, something shared by anyone who has ever felt their thoughts stretch into the quiet. It's the gentle awareness that the mind doesn't sleep when the night begins. It transitions, it changes pace, it reorients itself. It steps into a softer environment and moves differently there, slower, deeper, more inward. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is real. Your thoughts don't come forward because they want to pull you in. They come because they finally have the room to emerge without being overshadowed by the noise of the day. And as you sit in this early depth, you can feel the beginning of a quiet recognition. Your mind is active, yes, but it is not against you. It is not pushing you. It is not demanding. It is simply unfolding at the pace the night allows. You are witnessing the part of yourself that has always lived just beneath the surface, soft, persistent, unhurried. The part that refuses to rest right away, not because it's restless, but because it spends the day holding more than you realize. At night, it loosens just enough to show you the motion beneath its stillness. And in recognizing this motion, without resisting it, something inside you softens too. A small shift, a quiet ease, a gentle acceptance that the active mind is not an interruption. It is a natural presence, revealing itself slowly in the quiet that only night can offer. There is a particular moment in the night when you begin to notice not just the activity of your mind, but the patterns beneath it, the subtle ways. Thoughts return, the small reverberations they leave behind, the faint impressions that echo long after the original idea has passed. They don't feel heavy. They don't arrive with intensity. They come like quiet repetitions of something your inner world has been trying to express, not through words, but through presence. You may sense it as a gentle repetition, a familiar movement of the mind, circling back to ideas that haven't settled fully. Not because they demand resolution, but because they linger naturally in the quiet. A question that breathes slowly in the background. A feeling that doesn't sharpen, but doesn't fade either. A fragment of something unspoken, rising and receding without direction. These patterns don't move in straight lines. They drift, they curve, they return the way a faint murmur drifts into awareness, not intrusive, not insistent, simply present in a way that you can feel more than understand. Nighttime makes these subtle echoes easier to sense, not because they grow stronger, but because everything else grows softer. During the day, your mind filters, redirects, and organizes so many impressions that these quieter loops barely surface. But at night, when your surroundings stop pulling at your attention, the interior landscape becomes clearer. And in that clarity, the mind's repeated movements begin to show themselves not as problems, not as warnings, but as natural patterns of an inner world finally unhindered by noise. You might notice how a thought comes back with a slightly different shape than before. Not sharper, not deeper, just shifted, as if it has turned itself slightly in the darkness, showing you another side of its presence. It may be a worry, but softened by the quiet. It may be a memory, but stripped of its detail. It may be a feeling, but blurred enough that it no longer points anywhere. Just a looping presence of something that wants to be felt again. These loops aren't cycles of distress. They are cycles of acknowledgement. Your mind returns not to overwhelm you, but to understand its own rhythm. There's a rhythm to these nighttime echoes. A slow return, a pause, a lingering, a soft retreat. Not a spiral, just a gentle drift that brings thoughts back into the foreground with the faintest touch. And each time they return, they feel slightly different, as if softened by the darkness around them. They breathe differently here. They settle differently. They hold themselves with more quiet. In this part of the night, you may realize something subtle. Your thoughts are not trying to form conclusions. They're simply letting themselves be heard. Not fully, not loudly. Just enough for you to notice the outlines of what matters beneath them. This is why nighttime echoes don't feel like daytime analysis. They don't demand energy from you. They don't ask you to solve anything. They simply invite you to witness the shapes your mind forms when it doesn't need to perform or respond. Shapes that repeat gently, the way internal whispers linger long after they're first felt. Sometimes a thought returns with a slight emotional aftertaste, a gentle weight, not heavy, not sharp. It might bring with it the sense of something unfinished. But even this doesn't push you. It only drifts close enough for you to recognize that part of you has been holding it quietly all along. And in the quiet, these returns feel more like reflections than reminders. They don't tell you what to do. They don't point to what you should feel. They simply show you the natural motion of your mind when it has room to breathe. There is no wrongness in these echoes. They are part of being human, part of having an inner world that doesn't shut off just because the sun has gone down. You might sense how the patterns of your thoughts carry a kind of internal memory, not a storyline, not an image, but an emotional texture that reappears. A tone that repeats, a sensation that drifts forward again after fading back, like the lingering softness of a thought returning, because the quiet allows it to feel safe enough to emerge. In these moments, it becomes clear that your mind isn't looping because it's stuck. It's looping because it's alive, because it continues to move even when you're still, because it holds layers that don't reveal themselves all at once. And beneath all of this, that faint murmur inside you continues subtle, steady, nearly imperceptible, yet always present. It's the quiet resonance of your deeper thoughts responding to the night, a sign that your inner world is active not in agitation, but in awareness, a soft internal sound that marks the presence of your most delicate layers. There's something grounding in recognizing this, something reassuring in seeing that your thoughts don't have to be linear or organized to be meaningful. They don't have to make sense to be real. They don't have to resolve to have value. They only need room. And the night, in its quiet generosity, gives them that room. You may notice how the echoes begin to slow on their own. Not stopping, not disappearing, just loosening. The mind doesn't hold them with the same tightness. The returns feel farther apart, more relaxed, more like floating than circling, as if each loop becomes gentler, simply because it has been acknowledged in the quiet. This is the natural progression of nighttime thoughts: awareness, return, softening, release. Not forced release, not deliberate release, just the kind of release that happens when something is allowed to exist without pressure. And somewhere in that softening, you begin to feel a quiet shift in yourself, a subtle sense that the mind doesn't need to push anymore, that the echoes don't need to be clear, that your thoughts are allowed to rest in their own rhythm at their own pace without being shaped into something else. These nighttime patterns aren't obstacles. They are the gentle movements of a mind transitioning into a quieter state. The echoes that rise when everything else falls silent. The traces of yourself that surface when the world loses its noise. They come not to disturb your night, but to be held by it. And as they return, rise, soften, and linger, you begin to understand. This is not the mind resisting rest. It is the mind settling into it, slowly, quietly, naturally, in the only way it knows how. There's a point in the night when the mind begins to reveal not just its patterns, but the quiet mechanisms beneath them, the subtle forces that shape your thoughts before you ever notice them taking form. These mechanisms don't show themselves during the day. Daylight is too fast, too loud, too filled with demands for the mind to expose how it actually moves. But when night deepens and the world no longer presses against you, something inside loosens and the inner workings begin to surface not sharply, not clearly, but with a kind of quiet transparency. You might sense this shift before you understand it. A small change in the way your thoughts flow, a slight difference in how they rise. Not heavier, not louder, just more honest. The mind at night doesn't operate the way it does in daylight. It doesn't follow structure. It doesn't hold itself upright. It unfolds. It moves in faint tides, carrying with it small currents of emotions, tiny traces of memory, and barely noticeable shifts in attention. These currents don't announce themselves. You only feel their aftertouch, the way a thought lingers, the way a feeling shadows the edge of another thought, the way one fragment drifts into the next without any clear boundary. There is a softness in these movements, even when the thoughts themselves are unclear. A softness that doesn't come from ease, but from exposure. Night doesn't create these mechanisms. It reveals them. You may notice how certain thoughts rise, not because they are important, but because your mind has a natural rhythm of processing what it held throughout the day. A delayed processing that only begins when the environment grows quiet enough for the inner world to expand. The mind isn't trying to revisit anything. It's simply releasing what it absorbed. Not fully, not decisively, just enough for you to feel the motion beneath your awareness. Sometimes this motion feels like a slight pull from within, as though a deeper layer is stirring. Other times, it feels like a gentle drift, thoughts sliding past each other without form. And sometimes, it feels like nothing at all, just a subtle change in the atmosphere of your mind. These mechanisms don't rely on clarity. They rely on stillness. When the night lowers the noise around you, your internal systems begin to activate in quieter ways. Your thoughts shift from fast to slow. Your emotions shift from surface to depth. Your attention shifts from outward to inward. These shifts aren't choices. They're part of the architecture of being human. And beneath it all, there is that faint murmur, a soft internal vibration that doesn't speak, doesn't guide, doesn't define. It simply marks the presence of your underlying mental movement, a small, persistent hum of awareness that lives beneath your thoughts, beneath your feelings, beneath everything you consciously process. It isn't language. It isn't memory. It's the quiet pulse of your inner world responding to the night. You might sense how the mind begins to work through layers you didn't realize you carried, not by bringing them forward, but by letting them drift in the background. A slight emotional tone you hadn't noticed earlier, a question that doesn't fully form, an unfinished piece of meaning that hovers without direction. These are not thoughts you choose. They are thoughts that rise automatically when your mind is no longer holding itself tightly. Nighttime gives them room, not to overwhelm you, but to move freely. There is a natural loosening that happens here. The mind unclenches. Its grip on the day fades. Its boundaries soften. And in that softening, the mechanisms behind your mental activity begin to show. You might feel the beginnings of emotional undercurrents beneath certain thoughts, a tone, a warmth, a faint heaviness, a quiet longing. Nothing defined, nothing sharp. Just the emotional foundation of thoughts that are too quiet to articulate themselves. You may feel how your mind sorts itself, not logically, but organically. A thought comes forward, then drifts. Another rises, then dissolves. Feelings join them not directly, but as subtle colorings. The boundaries between them blur, just slightly, not merging, but resting close enough to influence one another. This is how the mind prepares itself for rest. Not by shutting down, but by exposing the motions that are usually hidden. Slow, low, quiet internal movements that show you the deeper layers of your consciousness. There is no intensity in this exposure, only softness, only the gentle revealing of how your inner world breathes when the outside world stops asking for your attention. You might sense how the mind's mechanisms include not just thoughts, but pauses, spaces between thoughts that stretch longer in the night, not emptiness breathing room, places where nothing is required, where nothing needs to be processed, where your inner world rests in a state of openness rather than effort. In these pauses, the murmur becomes more noticeable, not louder, just clearer. The underlying movement of your thoughts becomes easier to feel, not as meaning, not as message, as presence. This is the invisible architecture of your mind, the quiet way it holds what you've lived, what you've sensed, what you haven't fully processed yet. And it's only at night, in moments like this, that it becomes visible enough to feel. Nothing here asks for interpretation. Nothing here asks for action. The mechanisms don't want your involvement. They only want room. Room to shift. Room to breathe. Room to settle. And as they do, you begin to feel something subtle. Your mind is not trying to disturb your rest. It is preparing for it. Not through silence, but through gentle movement. Not through emptiness, but through soft processing. A natural unwinding. A quiet release. A slow realignment. What rises in this part of the night isn't noise, it's truth. The truth of how your mind works when nothing is demanded of it. The truth of how your inner world organizes itself when given space. The truth of how deeply human it is to have layers that only reveal themselves in darkness. These mechanisms don't make you restless. They make you real. And in sensing them softly, gently, without expectation, you begin to understand. Your nighttime thoughts are not interruptions to rest. They are the beginning of it. There is a moment in the night when the mind, after drifting through its loops and lingering patterns, begins to soften in a way that feels almost imperceptible. Not because the thoughts disappear, and not because anything has been resolved, but because the quiet around you has grown deep enough for the mind to release a little of the tension it carried. This softening doesn't happen all at once. It isn't a shift you can command. It is something that unfolds slowly, gently, almost shyly, like an inward sigh that doesn't need to be heard to be real. You might sense it as a slight loosening, a faint unclenching behind your thoughts, a subtle ease that touches the edges of your awareness. Not relief, not clarity, just a softening, a gentle settling into the night. The thoughts that once lingered with sharper outlines now begin to blur. Their edges soften, their presence lightens. They continue to exist, but they no longer push. They no longer feel like they need to be processed. They begin drifting, as if carried by a slower current, one that doesn't expect you to keep up. A current that moves at the pace of the night itself, quiet, steady, patient. This is not the mind becoming empty. It is the mind becoming gentle. You may notice how your thoughts now feel less like statements and more like impressions, less like ideas and more like textures. Their meanings matter less than their movements. A thought rises, but its edges dissolve before you can hold it. A feeling drifts forward, but softens before it forms. A memory scent appears faint and incomplete, not enough to grasp, but enough to sense. This softening is the mind's natural response to silence. When the world stops pressing against you, the mind stops pressing against itself. And beneath this gentle shift, that familiar murmur appears again, not as a repetition, not as an echo, but as a dim background tone. A presence that has accompanied you throughout the night, now fading just slightly, as if it too is settling. It becomes less defined, less directional, more like a soft warmth lying underneath your thoughts. You might feel the beginnings of something almost like calm, not the kind that requires effort, not the kind that demands stillness, but the quiet calm that comes from accepting the presence of your thoughts without trying to change them. A calm that doesn't erase the noise, but softens the space around it. There is a gentleness in realizing that soothing the mind does not mean silencing it. It means letting it move without resistance, letting it drift without expectation, letting it settle without pressure. You may notice how some thoughts that felt tense earlier now feel lighter. Their weight hasn't disappeared. It is simply redistributed into something more manageable, something softer. The mind is no longer holding them tightly. It lets them float, suspended in a space that isn't heavy enough to pull you in, but isn't empty enough to push you away. This is the quiet transformation of the nighttime mind, from sharpness into softness, from structure into drift, from intensity into presence. There's a kind of honesty in this softening, an acknowledgement that the mind does not need to rest perfectly to rest gently. It doesn't need to be quiet to feel quieter. It doesn't need to be empty to feel less full. It simply needs permission. Permission not given by you, but given by the night itself. You might feel your attention change shape here. It no longer reaches outward. It no longer scans. It simply rests on whatever rises. Not long enough to analyze, not deeply enough to unravel, just long enough to sense. This is the mind easing itself. This is the mind soothing itself. This is the mind adapting to the softness of the night. And as this happens, you may find that your thoughts begin to space themselves out. There is more room between them now. More quiet not because nothing is happening inside you, but because the mind is slowing down its pace. Thoughts come, but they come one at a time. They arrive softly, drift softly, fade softly. They move like shadows across the surface of your awareness, not dark, not frightening, just subtle. The night holds them all without demanding anything from you. And because it asks nothing, your mind begins to ask less of itself. You might feel the gentle beginnings of surrender, not an emotional surrender, not a dramatic release, but a small, quiet surrender of effort. The mind stops trying to solve. It stops trying to interpret. It stops trying to organize. It lets its movements be movements. It lets its patterns be patterns. It lets its echoes be echoes. In this softened state, even emotions feel different. They lose their edges. They lose their urgency. They become sensations rather than burdens. A feeling might rise, but it rises like mist, present but not gripping. A memory flavor might appear, but without detail, without insistence. A question might drift close, only to drift away before fully forming. Everything becomes gentler in the presence of soft thought. You may notice a warmth in this, a kind of inner tenderness that wasn't there earlier, not directed at anything specific, not tied to any particular emotion. Just a warmth that comes from the mind no longer bracing itself. The murmur within you becomes faint, here, fading into the background of your awareness. It hasn't disappeared. It has softened. It has aligned itself with the quiet rhythm of your thoughts. It becomes less like a presence and more like a feeling. A small, steady hum that reassures you without saying anything. And as the mind continues to ease, you begin to feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere of your inner world. A widening, a lightening, a soft release of whatever tension remained. Not a disappearance, just a quiet loosening. This is the natural transition the night brings, the moment when the mind begins to soothe itself without effort. When the thoughts that refused to rest earlier now drift with a gentleness that asks nothing of you. When the inner world, once full of small currents and restless movements, settles into a softer rhythm that doesn't require your involvement to unfold. In this softness, you begin to understand something without needing words for it. The mind doesn't quiet because you force it to. It quiets because the night gives it space to. And in that space, everything inside you becomes just a little more gentle thoughts. Feelings echoes, even the faint murmur that has followed you through the quiet. What happens here is not sleep. It is the beginning of rest, not the rest of the body, but the rest of the mind, a gentle natural softening that prepares you for what the night will bring next, without rushing, without forcing, simply by allowing itself to become tender in the quiet. There is a shift in the night that you don't always notice when it begins. A quiet deepening, a soft turn inward, a moment when the mind, after loosening itself, gently makes space for something more tender to rise. Not louder, not heavier, just closer. This is where the heart begins to speak in its own language, one that doesn't use words, one that isn't shaped by thought, one that shows itself only when the world is soft enough to hold it. You may feel this shift not as an emotion, but as a subtle weight, a quiet presence beneath your thoughts, something warm or something dim, or something simply there, resting in the quiet without needing to be defined. Night has a way of revealing this weight, not by making it stronger, but by making you quieter. When the mind stops pressing forward, the heart steps through its open spaces. This weight is not burden. It is not sorrow. It is not longing. It is simply the emotional residue of being human. At the end of a day, the accumulation of small feelings that didn't have room to breathe earlier. You may sense it as a heaviness that isn't painful, just present. A fullness that sits in the chest without tightening. A warmth that isn't comforting, but isn't discomfort either. Something in between. Something honest. This is the emotional weight that comes after sundown, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but settles gently quietly, as if it had been waiting for the night to arrive so it could finally take a seat beside you. You don't need to name it. It doesn't become clearer if you try. It becomes clearer when you simply let it be. There is a tenderness in realizing that this weight is not here to trouble you. It is here because the heart, like the mind, carries its own rhythms, rhythms that are often overshadowed during the day, rhythms that rise when silence allows them to. You might feel how this emotional weight interacts with the quiet around you. It grows softer. It spreads out. It stops feeling like something you're holding and starts feeling like something that is resting with you. There is no urgency in it, no demand, no narrative, just presence. And beneath this presence, there is that familiar murmur, a faint internal undercurrent that now shifts from the mind to the heart. Not a sound, not an image, just a quiet emotional vibration, subtle enough to barely notice, deep enough to feel without effort. You may sense how the heart opens in the night in ways it doesn't during the day. Not dramatically, not painfully, just honestly. The day requires you to hold certain feelings in place, to keep them structured, contained, organized, so you can move through tasks and conversations. But the night removes those structures. Without them, emotions don't rush forward. They settle. They become heavier, only in the sense that they become more real, more noticeable, more willing to be acknowledged. And in this acknowledgement, there is a softness that begins to form. A kind of quiet acceptance that says, yes, something is here, nothing more. No interpretation, no conclusion, just presence. You may find that the emotional weight after sundown has a rhythm of its own. It pulses gently. It expands, then settles. It drifts outward, then inward. Not a pattern of distress, a pattern of being alive. There is something deeply human about this moment, something universal, something that belongs to everyone who's ever felt their heart become more honest in the quiet. This weight might carry a trace of longing, or a trace of tender sadness, or a trace of something unresolved, or simply the warmth of everything you felt today, but didn't fully experience until now. None of these are wrong. None of them need to be named. They only need room. Night gives that room willingly. You might notice how your breath feels different here, not deeper, not slower, but more connected to the weight inside you. Not controlling it, not easing it, simply acknowledging it. Your breath expands around the feeling, as if to make space for it, as if to say, you can exist here. There is a relief in that. A quiet relief that doesn't feel like release, but feels like permission. Permission to feel something that isn't defined. Permission to hold something that isn't clear. Permission to be with yourself without needing to shape your inner world into something you can explain. This emotional weight doesn't ask for answers. It doesn't need understanding. It doesn't want fixing. It only wants what the night naturally provides, a place where it doesn't have to compete with anything else inside you. You may sense how the heart, now given this space, begins to soften. Not dramatically, not noticeably at first, but slowly, quietly, like fabric loosening its folds. The murmur inside you shifts again, now warmer, now slower, now more emotional than mental. It moves the way the heart moves when thought steps aside. It fills the space without demanding anything from it. And as the heart settles, you begin to understand something without needing language for it. Emotional weight is not heaviness. It is the accumulation of everything that mattered to you today, the small moments that stirred something, the unspoken thoughts that touched something tender, the brief connections that left traces of feeling behind. The night doesn't make them bigger. It makes them visible. It lets them exist without interruption. It gives them a softness they didn't have earlier. In this softness, you may sense a quiet truth. The heart doesn't become heavier at night. It becomes clearer. And clarity in the heart is not a sharp thing. It is a gentle glow, dim, warm, steady, a glow that rests in you without asking for anything beyond presence. Nothing here needs to change. Nothing here needs to be solved. Nothing here needs to be interpreted. The night doesn't ask that of you. It only asks that you sit with what rises, even if what rises is simply a quiet, unnamed emotional weight that feels more like being human than anything else. And in that presence, you begin to feel the night holding you, not away from your emotions, but with them, as if the quiet itself understands exactly how to make space for the weight that appears when the world goes dim. There is a kind of quiet that doesn't come from silence, but from the way your inner world begins to shift into gentler territory. After the emotional weight first makes itself known, something softer starts to rise beneath it, not in opposition, not as relief, but as a natural evolution of what happens when the heart feels allowed to exist without defense. This softness isn't dramatic. It isn't something you suddenly feel. It expands slowly, almost quietly, like a subtle warmth, growing in places that were held tight all day. You may notice it first as a tender quietness inside you, a quietness that doesn't silence your emotions, but cushions them. The heart doesn't stop feeling. It simply begins to feel differently, more gently, less sharply. Emotions that once had structure start to blur. Feelings that once seemed defined now become impressions. The heart enters a state where everything becomes softer at the edges, easier to hold, easier to sit with. This is not comfort in the traditional sense. It is not ease. It is something deeper, an inner softness that doesn't remove anything, but changes the atmosphere around it. You might feel how certain emotions no longer press into you the way they did earlier. They float a little. They move with a kind of fluidity that makes them less rigid, less fixed. Even emotions that felt heavy carry a gentler weight, now warm instead of tight, full instead of burdened. The night makes room for this transformation, not by changing your emotions, but by softening the space that holds them. And in this softened space, something inside you begins to settle. Not fully, not finally, just enough for you to sense that the heart is shifting into a quieter state. This is where the tender feelings live, the ones that don't make themselves known. When life is loud, the ones that exist in the subtle corners of your emotional world, the ones that rise only when the night has grown deep enough to hold them gently. You may notice a warmth that isn't tied to any memory or thought, a warmth that sits inside you like a small ember glowing quietly, not bright, not sharp, simply warm. This warmth isn't telling you anything. It isn't signaling anything. It is simply the presence of your emotional core becoming more visible. During the day, you keep that core protected not intentionally, but by necessity. The world is too bright, too fast, too exposed for these quiet feelings to rise. But at night, when everything softens, the heart loosens too, and the softness inside you begins to show. You may sense the faintest inner tenderness, a delicate recognition of the parts of yourself that don't speak loudly, that don't demand attention, that don't need explanation. This tenderness might feel like a slight ache, but not a painful one. More like the gentle sensation of touching something real, something vulnerable, something deeply human. And beneath this tenderness, there is that subtle murmur again, no longer a mental echo, no longer a drift of thoughts, but an emotional undercurrent, a quiet internal vibration that holds the softness together. This murmur doesn't feel like movement or sound. It feels like presence, a presence that wraps itself lightly around the emotions that rise now, not to contain them, but to accompany them. You might notice how the heart becomes quieter in this state, not numb, not muted, just quieter, as if it trusts the night enough to let its gentler feelings come forward. These quiet feelings are often the ones you rarely let yourself feel during the day, not because they're uncomfortable, but because they require a kind of stillness that daytime rarely gives. Feelings that say, "I'm here," without urgency, without need, without direction. Feelings that speak in the language of tenderness rather than narrative. Feelings that do not explain themselves because they don't need to. You may sense a soft longing that doesn't point anywhere, or a gentle sadness that doesn't ask for interpretation, or a faint hope that doesn't form into thought, or simply the presence of emotional depth without any story attached. Everything becomes more subtle, more interior, more fluid. And in that fluidity, you begin to understand something quietly profound. Emotional softness is not weakness. It is depth. It is honesty. It is the heart showing itself in ways it cannot during the day. There's a sense of relief in this softness, not because anything resolves, but because nothing needs to. You're not trying to understand your feelings. You're not trying to manage them. You're not trying to shape them. You're simply allowing them to exist in their tender form. This allowing creates a gentler rhythm inside you, a rhythm that moves in slow waves, a rhythm that shifts weight without pressure, a rhythm that aligns with the quiet of the night. You may feel the heart's edges soften even further, as if it's stretching into the stillness, breathing a little deeper, opening itself with the smallest degree of trust. This is subtle work, soft work, silent work. It is the heart's way of returning to itself, not through clarity and not through resolution, but through quiet presence. The murmur becomes softer here, not fading, not disappearing, just blending into the emotional warmth that now fills the space inside you. There might be a moment when you realize that even the emotional weight from before feels different now, still present, still real, but less defined, less sharp, less lonely. Soft feelings have a way of holding heavier ones without pushing them away. They act like cushions, gentle, warm, steady. They let weight be weight, but soften its contact with you. And as this tenderness settles inside you, something becomes clear without needing to be stated. The heart, when given quiet, does not harden. It softens. It opens. It shows you its gentlest truths, not to overwhelm you, but to remind you that you're more tender than you allow yourself to be during the day, more sensitive, more human, more alive in the quiet than you realize. And in this tender quietness, you begin to feel the night holding you not tightly, not protectively, but softly, the way one quiet presence holds another. Nothing to fix, nothing to change. Only softness rising exactly where it needs to in the deepest part of the quiet. There's a particular way emotions move in the quiet so subtle, you rarely notice it until the night has settled deeply around you. They don't shift in the dramatic way thoughts do. They don't push or pull. They drift. They soften. They rearrange themselves in small, nearly invisible motions that only become perceptible when everything else grows still enough for the heart to breathe without interruption. You may sense this shift before you understand it. A slight change in the tone of what you feel. A quiet settling in places that carried a gentle ache moments earlier. A widening of emotional space that doesn't remove anything, but lets everything sit more comfortably. This movement of emotion is not logical. It doesn't follow the order of your thoughts. It doesn't follow memory. It follows the night's rhythm. The silence around you creates room for emotions to adjust themselves not into clarity, but into gentleness. Something that felt heavy becomes warmer. Something that felt sharp becomes rounder. Something that felt unresolved becomes softer in a way that doesn't require resolution. Night doesn't change what you feel. It changes the way you experience it. You may notice how feelings stop leaning forward. They stop looking for meaning. They stop reaching toward the mind for interpretation. Instead, they sink slightly inward, resting into themselves, forming a softer presence that moves at the pace of your breathing. Not because you are trying to calm them, but because the night naturally eases their edges. This is how emotions shift in silence slowly, organically, gently, in the same way a dim light settles over a room without altering what's inside it. You might feel an emotion rise just slightly, then fall again. Not dramatically. More like a small wave, smoothing itself out before it reaches the shore. Or you might feel a sensation move from one place inside you to another. Not to escape, but to settle into the space that feels most open. At night, feelings don't demand direction. They follow comfort. This kind of emotional movement is often overlooked during the day because daylight doesn't provide the softness required for feelings to show their subtler forms. But the night is different. It creates a kind of quiet where emotions can unfold without the pressure of understanding. They can simply exist as textures rather than narratives. You may sense a feeling that was earlier close to sadness, now softened into something almost tender. Not because the sadness changed, but because the quiet allows it to experience itself without the sharpness it carries in the noise of the day. Or you may sense a hint of longing turning into warmth, not because anything was resolved, but because silence makes room for the heart to hold longing gently. Or You might feel an old memory lose its weight, not disappearing, not diminishing, just settling in a more comfortable place inside you. These shifts are not choices. They are the heart's natural movements when it is no longer overwhelmed. And beneath all of this, the faint murmur that has been with you since the first part of the night shifts in tone. It becomes less like a background vibration of the mind and more like an emotional hum, quiet and low, holding the movement of your feelings together without defining them. It exists not as thought and not as emotion, but as the soft bridge between the two, a subtle pulse at the center of your inner world. This is the point in the night where the mind and heart stop competing for space. They begin to influence each other gently. Emotions drift into thoughts. Thoughts carry hints of feelings. The separation between them becomes less rigid, less structured. You may notice how a feeling informs the tone of a thought without altering its meaning, or how a thought carries an emotional warmth that wasn't there earlier, or how a quiet memory rises not with narrative but with mood. The heart and mind begin to communicate in the softest ways, not through clarity, not through insight, through presence. This presence doesn't bring understanding, it brings alignment. A quiet alignment that lets both your thoughts and feelings rest in the same internal place without tension. You may sense how the emotional warmth you felt earlier begins to spread through your awareness, not as intensity, but as a gentle expansion. The heaviness of emotion becomes less like weight and more like depth. The tenderness becomes less like ache and more like quiet truth. The softness becomes less like fragility and more like openness. There is a moment when you realize that nothing is pulling against you internally. Your emotions aren't trying to speak. Your mind isn't trying to answer. Everything is simply moving at the same pace, a slow, quiet, steady rhythm shaped by the night. And in this shared rhythm, something inside you loosens even further, not because something changed, but because you've entered a part of the night where emotions can shift without needing direction. This is where emotional transitions at night reveal their gentle nature. They don't transform you. They don't fix you. They don't clarify anything. They settle you. They soften you. They allow you to feel your inner world without being overwhelmed by it. The murmur inside you becomes lighter, less pronounced, more blended into the atmosphere of your emotions. It's no longer a signal of internal movement, but the soft tone that accompanies your emotional presence. It reminds you not that something is happening, but simply that you are here, feeling in the quiet, without expectation. And in this moment, you begin to sense something profoundly human. Your emotions shift naturally in silence. They don't need effort. They don't need intervention. They don't need to be shaped or understood. They simply need room. And the night, in its patient stillness, gives them exactly that. Here in this softness, you don't have to ask anything from your emotions. And they don't ask anything from you. They drift quietly inside you, finding their place while you sit in the dim quiet of your own depth, held gently by the night and softened by the quiet shifts of your heart. There is a point in the night when the distance between your thoughts and your emotions begins to feel almost invisible, not merged, not tangled, but resting so closely together that it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. This isn't confusion. It isn't overwhelm. It's a natural convergence, the kind that happens when both the mind and the heart quiet down enough to hear each other without interruption. You may sense this as a subtle alignment inside you, a gentle harmony, a quiet weaving of two inner currents that usually move on separate tracks during the day. Thoughts soften into feeling. Feelings drift into thought. Neither dominates, neither retreats. They simply coexist in a quieter, more fluid form. The mind no longer carrying the sharpness it had earlier rests in a softer rhythm. The heart no longer protected by the layers of daylight rests in a more open state. And between the two, something delicate begins to happen. Not a dialogue, not an exchange, but a quiet blending. It starts with subtle impressions. A thought rises, but with an emotional tone you can feel beneath it. An emotion appears, but with a trace of thought shaping its outline. Both currents hold each other gently as if they are moving through the same quiet space. This is not analysis. This is not introspection. This is the simple human convergence of mind and heart when neither is trying to lead. You may notice how understanding begins to feel less like thinking and more like sensing. Not insight, not clarity, just a deeper awareness of your inner world taking shape without being asked to define itself. In this softness, the murmur you've carried through the night changes again. It becomes quieter, deeper, more diffused, a faint internal hum that now belongs to both your thoughts and your emotions. Not separate currents, but one gentle vibration that moves across your whole inner space. You might feel how a thought that would normally feel neutral carries a quiet emotional resonance now, or how an emotion that would normally feel undefined carries a gentle direction. Not enough to guide you, not enough to structure anything, just enough to soften the space where the two overlap. This overlap is where human depth reveals itself, not in clarity, not in meaning, but in the quiet awareness that your mind and heart are not separate realms. They are parts of the same interior landscape, illuminated differently by day and by night. The night makes them visible together. You may feel a tenderness in this realization. Not an emotional tenderness, but an inner tenderness, a recognition that the parts of you that feel and the parts of you that think are not at odds with each other. They are simply different expressions of the same inner truth. When they move together, everything inside you feels more organic, less fragmented, less divided, more whole. You might sense a thought drifting through you with a feeling attached, not a strong feeling, just a soft presence. Or an emotion rising with a trace of meaning, not a narrative, not a memory, just a tone. The boundaries blur gently, never fully disappearing, but becoming porous enough for you to feel the connection between your mental and emotional life. This connection is what the night brings out, not because darkness changes you, but because it removes the noise that separates your inner layers. The mind in its softened state no longer tries to control or organize. The heart in its tender openness no longer tries to protect or withhold. And together, they move in a shared rhythm shaped by the quiet. You may notice that even the weight you felt earlier has shifted subtly. It doesn't sit in the heart alone. It doesn't sit in the mind alone. It floats somewhere between the two, a gentle presence rather than a burden. There is something deeply grounding in this in-between state, something human in the way your mind and heart reflect each other softly, each shaping the other without pressure. A slow thought feels warmer. A quiet emotion feels clearer. A small memory feels less sharp. A moment of uncertainty feels less lonely. None of this moves you toward sleep yet. It moves you toward yourself, toward a quieter awareness of how your inner world works when it doesn't have to perform for the day, when it doesn't have to hold itself together, when it doesn't have to divide its functions into thinking and feeling. This is the natural weaving that happens in the deeper part of night, an interior lowering of walls you didn't realize existed. A soft merging of patterns you didn't know were separate. A quiet coherence that forms without effort, without intention, without direction. You may find yourself breathing differently here, not deeper, not slower, but more in sync with a rhythm inside you. A rhythm that is neither mind nor heart, but both. In this gentle convergence, the murmur inside you becomes something almost like a quiet emotional breath, steady low, unbroken. It holds everything together without tightening. It softens everything without dissolving it. And as you rest in this state, you begin to feel the night holding you not in layers, but as a whole, a quiet, complete presence where your thoughts and emotions move together as if they were always meant to. Here, nothing needs to be separated. Nothing needs to be labeled. Nothing needs to be resolved. The mind and heart understand each other in the only way that matters right now, through quiet companionship in the softness of the night. And in that companionship, you begin to sense a truth that doesn't need words. You are not divided inside. You are not split between thinking and feeling. You are one in a way you can only feel when the night has grown deep enough to show you. There is a moment deep in the night when something shifts, not dramatically, not noticeably at first, but in a way that makes you aware of the parts of yourself that only appear when the world is quiet enough for you to meet them. These aren't thoughts. They aren't emotions. They aren't memories. They're simply tendencies, patterns of being human that rise softly in the dark when nothing outside is loud enough to drown them out. You may sense this shift as a kind of widening inside you. Not clarity, not awakening, just a gentle broadening of your inner space, where the deeper layers of your nature begin to move. It's the moment when you realize that nighttime doesn't just expose thoughts or feelings, it exposes you. Not the version of you shaped by the day, but the version that exists underneath everything you show the world. This version is quieter, more honest, more tender. It carries the traces of what you've lived, the softness of what you felt, the depth of what you rarely express. And in the night, these traces don't ask for attention. They simply rise because night gives them room. You might feel how your inner world becomes more transparent here. Not open in a vulnerable way, but open in the sense that you can sense yourself more fully. Your thoughts feel closer to your emotions. Your emotions feel closer to your memories. Everything rests nearer to the surface. You may notice how certain tendencies reveal themselves. A tendency to reflect more deeply, a tendency to feel more sensitively, a tendency to drift into thoughts that carry quiet meaning, a tendency to notice what you overlooked earlier, a tendency to step into a version of yourself that feels truer, even if softer. These tendencies aren't flaws. They aren't weaknesses. They aren't signs of anything wrong. They are human. They belong to the part of you that exists beneath the performance, beneath the structure, beneath the obligations of the day. The part of you that needs softness to appear. the part that the night naturally reaches. You may sense how your inner edges grow less rigid here, how your reactions feel gentler, how your thoughts feel less defensive, how your emotions feel less guarded. Even your quiet fears feel different, less like alarms, more like truths you haven't spoken yet. Night reveals them, not to unsettle you, but to show you that you're more layered than you allow yourself to be. And beneath these layers, the familiar murmur appears again, a faint vibration of your inner being, a soft pulse that doesn't speak or instruct, but simply marks the presence of your deeper self rising in the quiet. This murmur feels more grounded now, not as a moving thought, not as an emotional echo, but as a quiet hum of your human nature, present beneath everything, steady, unavoidable, in the softness of night. You may notice how certain tendencies appear only when silence grows long enough, a tendency to revisit who you are beneath your roles, a tendency to feel the weight of your own depth, a tendency to drift toward the emotional corners you ignore during the day, a tendency to see yourself with more honesty, not harsh honesty, just quiet, unfiltered truth. There is nothing threatening in this. There is only recognition, nighttime recognition. This is what humans do when the world dims. They turn inward, not to escape anything, but because the inner world finally has space to breathe. You might feel a tiny pull toward self-reflection, not analytical reflection, not problem-solving, just the gentle awareness of your own depth. You may feel an ache that doesn't hurt, but reminds you of something tender inside you. You may feel a longing that has no direction, only tone. You may feel a softness in places that were firm just hours ago. These are normal. They're universal. They belong to the rhythm of being human. When night comes, the human mind and heart both loosen. Not because darkness creates emotion, but because it removes the noise that keeps you from feeling it. You're not more emotional at night. You're more open. You're more receptive. You're more in touch with the parts of yourself that daylight encourages you to set aside. You might even sense how your inner world shifts away from thinking and toward existing, not planning, not analyzing, just existing softly, quietly, with all the layers of your humanity resting closer together. And in these layers, you begin to notice the natural tendencies that define the human experience, the tendency to wonder, the tendency to remember, the tendency to hope, the tendency to ache, the tendency to soften, the tendency to feel alone and connected at the same time, the tendency to long for something you can't name, the tendency to learn yourself through quiet rather than clarity. None of these tendencies are dramatic. They simply emerge here because night allows them to. Even the thoughts and emotions that once felt separate begin to move together, slowly, gently, without force. Night doesn't collapse the distance between them. It reduces the volume around them until you can sense what lies beneath both. And what lies beneath is your human nature, your inclination to feel deeply, even when you don't intend, to your capacity for quiet reflection, your sensitivity to the subtle textures of your inner world. This sensitivity is not fragility. It is depth. It is awareness. It is the natural, honest unfolding of who you are when the noise of the world fades enough to let you feel the truth of your own existence. The murmur grows softer here, but more pervasive, no longer attached to thought or emotion, but diffused through your entire sense of being. It feels like a quiet hum of humanity, a reminder that your inner world carries a softness that doesn't need explaining. And in this moment, you understand something without needing words. Night reveals the human in you, the delicate, layered, sensitive, deep part that only needs stillness to show itself. Nothing here needs to change. Nothing here needs to be resolved. Nothing here needs to be fixed. You are simply meeting your own human nature in the quiet space where it feels safe enough to rise. There is a certain depth the night reveals when it becomes quiet enough, not around you, but within you. A depth that doesn't come from thinking and doesn't come from feeling, but from something older, something rooted in memory, not as stories or images, but as presence. When the world becomes soft enough, the past doesn't return in detail. It returns in feeling. It rises not as a narrative, but as an atmosphere. And you can sense it in the subtle way your inner world begins to fill with something familiar, something you've known before, even if you can't place where or when. You may feel it first as a faint emotional temperature, a quiet shift that is neither warm nor cold, neither heavy nor light. Just a gentle tone that spreads through the chest and lingers. It isn't a memory. It isn't recollection. It's the emotional presence of memory, the outline of something you've lived, that rises in the night, not to be remembered, but to be felt. In this quiet space, memory becomes less about the past and more about the emotional traces it left inside you. Not the details, not the images, just the lingering truth of what stayed with you long after the moment itself ended. You might feel the faint echo of an old tenderness, or the soft afterglow of something that once mattered, or the outline of a connection, or the emotional texture of a time when you felt differently than you do now. None of these come back clearly. Night doesn't bring clarity. Night brings presence. And presence is softer, quieter, more honest than memory ever is in daylight. These emotional presences don't ask you to revisit anything. They don't pull you into old stories. They don't demand you recall what happened. They rise only because stillness makes space for them, because your heart and mind are quiet enough to feel what has been quietly living in you all along. You might notice a slight ache, gentle and without direction. Not hurt, not longing, just the recognition that certain memories did not leave you. They simply changed form. Or you may sense a warmth, soft and steady, without a source, without a name. A warmth that feels like a soft echo of moments when you felt safe or seen or connected. Memory at night has no images, no scenes, no characters. It has tone. Tone is what remains after everything else fades. Tone is what the heart remembers when the mind lets go of the details. And beneath that tone, you sense the familiar murmur again, this time quieter than ever, a soft emotional resonance that gives shape to the memory presence without defining it. It feels like an interior hum of recognition, as if something inside you is quietly saying, yes, this has lived in you before, not in words, not in thought, just in the deep, quiet way memory lingers in the emotional body long after the mind forgets. You may feel your inner world expand slightly as these memory tones rise, not outward, inward. A soft widening, as if your emotional landscape has opened a little more space for the things you once felt to breathe again tonight. But nothing overwhelms. Nothing floods. Night brings memory forward in its gentlest form. You may sense how certain emotions tonight do not belong entirely to this moment. Some of them carry the weight of something older. Some carry the warmth of something tender. Some carry the quiet ache of what was once important. But all of them come softened by the dark, stripped of sharpness, stripped of interpretation, stripped of urgency. It is not the past revisiting you. It is the emotional presence of what shaped you, moving quietly inside the stillness. You might notice how these memory tones drift at their own pace. A rise, a pause, a slow fade. No direction, no pressure. Memory doesn't come back to be solved. It comes back to be felt. And in the night, feeling is gentler than remembering. This is the form memory takes when it is safe to surface, not as story, but as softness. Not as detail, but as depth. Not as recollection, but as presence. You may sense how these emotional presences weave themselves subtly into your current state, a present feeling wrapped in an old tone, a quiet ache touched by something long past, a softness layered with familiarity, a heaviness that feels ancient but not painful. You're not being pulled back. You are simply feeling the parts of yourself that were shaped quietly by the past. The night reveals that your inner world is not made of isolated moments, but of accumulated emotional threads woven together into the person you are still alive inside you, still breathing in ways you can only sense when the world becomes quiet enough. And as you feel these threads, the murmur inside grows more diffused, no longer one tone, but many quiet tones blending softly. It is the soundless hum of everything you've carried, gathered into one feeling that has no name, no story, no beginning. Just presence, human presence, emotional presence, memory presence. This is the part of the night where you meet the version of yourself that has lived through so many quiet moments and carried them forward in silence. There is no need to dig, no need to interpret, no need to identify where each feeling came from. Memory isn't asking for that. It is asking only to be acknowledged in the softest way, as something that lives in you, moves in you, shapes you quietly. And in that acknowledgement, something inside you settles, not into certainty, not into closure, into depth. A depth that doesn't need to be understood to be real. There is a point in the night when the subtle traces of memory begin to blend into something even quieter, something not tied to the past or the present, but to the deeper way your heart processes what it has carried for a long time. This is not remembering. This is not feeling. This is something more delicate, more internal, the quiet emergence of old emotional shadows, not in darkness, not in heaviness, but in the soft way they linger just beneath the surface of your awareness. You may sense it, not as sadness, not as longing, but as a faint residue, a tone left over from feelings that once mattered deeply, a softness shaped by moments that no longer return as images, but still breathe within you as echoes. These echoes do not form stories. They do not ask to be revisited. They simply appear because the night has grown deep enough for your emotional shadows to feel safe coming forward. An emotional shadow is not a wound. It is not pain. It is the gentle imprint of what once touched you profoundly, the tenderness of an old connection, the quiet ache of something unfinished, the warmth of something cherished, the echo of a version of yourself that once felt differently. You may not know where these shadows come from. You may not recognize their source. That doesn't matter. Night doesn't bring them for naming. Night brings them for acknowledgement. They appear like soft glimmers, not bright enough to illuminate anything, but present enough to add a slight tonality to the deeper layers of your emotional world. A hint of warmth that doesn't belong to this moment. A faint ache that isn't quite sadness. A subtle pulse of sensitivity that has no clear origin. A softness that moves like a breeze through your inner space. These shadows don't want understanding. They want room. And in the quiet, they find it. You may notice how your body responds, not with tension, but with a kind of surrender, a loosening in the chest, a quiet release in the breath, a gentle acceptance that something old is rising not to confront you, but to soften you. It's in moments like these that the line between past and present dissolves. Not because you're remembering anything, but because your emotional continuity becomes clear, the awareness that who you are now includes every feeling you've ever held, even the ones you don't recall. Night reveals this truth with tenderness. It doesn't overwhelm you with the weight of your past. It offers you the softness of its emotional imprint. And beneath all of this, the faint murmur inside you shifts yet again. No longer the mind's hum, no longer the warmth of the heart's openness, but a deeper resonance, as if the emotional shadows themselves carry a quiet vibration that moves through you in the gentlest way. This murmur feels older, not in age, but in depth. It feels like the emotional inheritance of everything you have ever lived through that still lives quietly in your inner world. You may sense how these shadows move differently than thoughts or emotions. They drift instead of rise. They settle instead of intensify. They expand instead of direct. They linger instead of fade. And yet they do all of this softly, so softly that you don't feel pulled, only touched. This is where the night reveals the emotional continuity. You carry the subtle threads of yourself that stretch across time, quietly shaping the way you feel without ever demanding your attention. You might sense a trace of old comfort, a trace of old fear, a trace of old tenderness, a trace of old hope, a trace of something you've forgotten, but your heart has not. None of it feels overwhelming. It feels ancient in the gentlest way, like the dim afterglow of an experience that shaped you quietly and never left. These emotional shadows are not your past intruding. They are your depth emerging. They show you that your emotional life is not linear, not neatly organized, not separate by years or moments. It is layered, woven alive, carried in tones instead of memories, felt in textures instead of thoughts. And the night with its slow descent makes these textures visible in the only way they can be seen, not through clarity, but through feeling. A feeling that is gentle, a feeling that is human, a feeling that reminds you that even when you forget the stories, your inner world remembers the emotions in its own quiet, soft, tender form. You may feel a moment of stillness here, a pause inside your awareness where nothing moves, yet everything is present. The emotional shadows neither advance nor retreat. They simply rest as if acknowledging that you are meeting them in the exact softness they needed. And you might realize something. In this stillness, your emotional world is not trying to bring you back. It is trying to show you that you never left yourself. These shadows are the quiet evidence of the paths you've walked, the connections you've made, the moments that shape the way you feel, the parts of you that learn tenderness by living through things you may not even remember now. There is no need to chase these feelings, no need to interpret them, no need to assign meaning. The night does not ask that of you. It only asks that you allow these soft, ancient tones to pass through you without resistance, the way they naturally do when the world outside is quiet enough for the deeper layers of your inner life to breathe. And in that gentle breathing, you begin to sense the simple truth behind emotional shadows. They are not there to burden you. They are there to remind you that you have felt deeply, and that depth remains in you alive, soft, quiet, waiting only for stillness to rise. There is a depth the night reveals that doesn't belong to memory anymore and doesn't belong to emotion alone. It belongs to something quieter, something underneath both your inner sensitivity, the delicate layer of your being that responds not to what you think or what you remember, but to the simple fact that you feel. This sensitivity doesn't show itself during the day. Daylight makes you stronger, faster, more reactive. But night slows you down enough for your sensitivity to rise without fear of being too much. You may feel it as a soft tremor inside you, not a shaking, not discomfort, just a subtle awareness that your inner world is more open, more exposed, more receptive to the small movements of feeling that daytime noise hides. It begins with a quiet noticing, a slight shift in the tone of your emotions, a deeper breath that doesn't come from your lungs, a faint awareness of the way your chest expands, not with air, but with sensitivity. This sensitivity isn't about being fragile. It's about being alive. When the world becomes quiet enough, your inner self becomes clearer. You start to feel not just what is rising, but the way it rises. Not just what lingers, but why it lingers, not in explanation, but in texture. You may notice how emotions feel closer to the surface now. Not heavy, not loud, just closer, as if they've stepped forward a little, not trying to speak, but trying to be seen, or rather, to be felt. You might feel a small ache that doesn't hurt, but reminds you that you still carry tenderness in places you thought had toughened. You might feel a warmth that doesn't brighten, but spreads softly across your chest, like something gently unfolding. You might feel an attention to your own inner world that isn't intentional, but natural. This sensitivity is not weakness. It is a sign that your mind and heart have softened enough to show you the truest parts of yourself. During the day, you protect these parts, not consciously, but naturally, because life requires you to move quicker, to respond faster, to keep certain feelings tucked beneath the pace of your responsibilities. But at night, your deeper sensitivity emerges not as a spotlight, but as a quiet glow. A glow you can only sense when nothing is demanding your strength. And beneath this glow, the familiar murmur returns now softer than ever, spread across your awareness like a low emotional hum. It no longer feels like thought and no longer feels like memory. It feels like a quiet pulse of who you are beneath everything you show. This murmur guides your sensitivity gently, not by directing it, but by holding it. You might begin noticing small things you didn't feel earlier, the way certain emotions touch each other inside you, the way some feelings rise with warmth, while others rise with shadow, the way your heart responds to quiet with more honesty than it ever does to noise. These observations don't come from analysis. They come from sensitivity, the kind that grows only in stillness. This is where the night reveals your emotional truth. your ability to feel deeply quietly, without explanation, without pressure. You may sense how your sensitivity changes the way feelings behave. A feeling that once felt pointed becomes round. A feeling that once felt heavy becomes gentle. A feeling that once felt dull becomes warm. A feeling that once felt distant becomes intimate. Nothing intensifies. Everything softens. Because sensitivity is not about feeling more, it's about feeling truer. This is why emotional sensitivity at night doesn't overwhelm you. It reduces the distance between you and yourself. It connects the layers of your inner world that spend the day separated by tasks, by expectations, by distractions. You might feel the beginnings of an inner tenderness, a softness that wraps itself around even the most subtle emotions. You feel not just the emotions themselves, but the quiet humanity inside them. Because sensitivity is the place where emotion turns into meaning, not mental meaning, but human meaning. You may notice how even the emotional shadows from earlier feel different now. They feel less like echoes and more like living threads woven into your present state, not trying to pull you backward, but gently reminding you that who you are now includes every quiet thing you have ever felt. There is depth in that realization, depth that doesn't demand understanding but invites compassion. You begin to see that sensitivity is not something that happens to you. It is something that belongs to you, something that returns when stillness makes space for it. The night doesn't make you emotional. It makes you honest. It reveals that beneath the noise, beneath the pace of the day, beneath the roles you play, your inner self remains tender, sensitive to connection, to loss, to hope, to quiet beauty, to soft truth. And this tender self is not a weakness. It is the truest part of your resilience. Because sensitivity teaches you how deeply you can feel without breaking, how much you can carry without hardening, how quietly you can heal without forcing anything. You may sense a small swell of emotion here, not sharp, not defined, just a soft fullness that proves your inner life is still warm, still alive, still open. The murmur that travels through you now feels like a thread, thin, steady, connecting each layer of your emotional world, not binding you, but holding you gently. And you begin to understand something profound in this state. Your sensitivity is not something the night brings out of you. It is something the night reveals, something that was already present, waiting for quiet to rise. It shows you what you've carried gently, what you felt quietly, what you've held without words. And in this tender space, you realize you are not fragile, you are open. Open enough to feel deeply. Open enough to notice softly. Open enough to meet your inner world without fear. This is the quiet depth of human sensitivity, the truth of what you feel when nothing forces you to hide it. There is a moment deep in the night when everything inside you begins to slow. Not your thoughts, which have already softened, and not your emotions, which have already opened, but the entire rhythm of your inner world. It's a slowing that feels less like stillness and more like a gentle descent, as though all the internal currents that have moved quietly through the evening now begin to settle toward the bottom of your awareness. This descent isn't sudden. It isn't dramatic. It feels like the soft landing of something that has been drifting for hours. You may sense it first as a shift in your attention, a subtle dimming of the mind's sharpness, a quiet reduction in the volume of your inner sensitivity, a feeling that everything inside you is beginning to lower itself into a calmer, heavier, quieter state. This is the beginning of the emotional fade, not disappearance, but softening, not numbness, but depth without movement. It's a moment where your inner world no longer rises. It settles. Thoughts that once hovered now sink into the background. Emotions that once felt tender now lie flatter, quieter, as if they've exhaled completely. Memories that once carried tone now dissolve into the faintest impressions. Nothing is gone. Nothing is forgotten. Everything has simply lowered its frequency. You may notice a slight heaviness in the chest or the breath, not emotional heaviness, but the weight of your inner world settling peacefully. A grounding weight, a natural weight, a weight that feels like the emotional equivalent of placing something gently onto a quiet surface. This weight doesn't press, it rests. The night has carried you through layers of thought, layers of emotion, layers of sensitivity. And now naturally, those layers begin to quiet themselves. You might feel the beginning of a soft dimness, the way light fades, not by turning off, but by lowering itself. Your inner world behaves the same way now, light dimming movement, slowing edges, dissolving. This dimming isn't emotional, it's perceptual. You begin to sense less because your mind is no longer trying to sense. You begin to feel less, not because feelings disappear, but because their shapes loosen and fall into softer outlines. In this state, the familiar murmur inside you changes again. It becomes lighter, airier, almost transparent, not because it is fading, but because every part of your inner world is shifting toward a quieter register. The murmur becomes like the last vibration of sound after the note has been played and the air still remembers it. Faint, soft, barely there, but still present enough to feel. You may notice how thoughts begin to lose structure, not in confusion, but in simplicity. They come as half thoughts, slight impressions, brief flickers that do not form sentences anymore. Emotions spread thinner now. They feel like gentle layers rather than active pulses. A soft warmth here, a slight shadow there. Nothing sharp, nothing urgent. This is emotional fade out, not emptiness, not silence, just the gradual lowering of everything you've been carrying. You might feel the mind drifting slightly, as if it is no longer focused inward, but simply floating in the soft atmosphere of the night. Or you might feel the heart resting without the small movements that carried you earlier. No ache, no longing, no tenderness trying to rise. Just quiet. Quiet not as absence, but as completion. A completion of the night's internal journey. Mind, loosening heart, opening sensitivity, rising memory, settling, and now everything lowering into one soft final descent. There is something profoundly peaceful about this part of the night. It isn't peace created by calm thoughts or warm emotions or soothing imagery. It is peace created by the simple fact that everything inside you is no longer moving toward anything. It is resting. You may feel your breath deepen without trying. You may feel your body become heavier without effort. You may feel your awareness spread thinner, like it is dissolving into the surrounding quiet. This is not sleep, not yet. It is the precursor to rest, the emotional clearing before the body finally lets go. And in this clearing, your inner world becomes almost silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, that has finally stopped shifting. The murmur becomes just a faint trace, like something remembered from earlier in the night that is no longer active, no longer rising, just gently fading at the bottom of your awareness. You may sense how emotions stop carrying tone, how thoughts stop carrying shape, how memories stop carrying presence, not because they are gone, but because they have all reached the same quiet level, a soft, low, gentle background where nothing stands out anymore. This is the emotional descent the night brings the moment when your inner world lowers itself not into darkness, but into deep quiet. Nothing inside you is asking for anything now. Nothing is pulling. Nothing is rising. Nothing is echoing. Everything is at rest, even if you are still awake. You are experiencing the last layer of inner quiet before sleep, the soft threshold where your awareness is still present, but no longer participating, where your thoughts still exist, but no longer form, where your emotions still breathe, but no longer move, where your sensitivity still feels, but no longer expands. You may feel like you are floating, or like you are sinking, or like you are simply resting between worlds, the waking mind, dimming the sleeping mind, not yet awake. This is the final descent into nighttime rest, a slow, gentle fading of everything inside you until all that remains is quiet. Quiet without effort, quiet without intention, quiet because your inner world has lowered itself into the softest part of the night. And as everything fades, you understand something without language. Rest is not something you reach. It is something you fall into when the night has carried you softly enough to let go. There is a moment late in the night when your inner world becomes so quiet, so softened, so dimly lit from within that thoughts no longer try to rise and emotions no longer try to settle. They simply drift. Not upward, not downward, not outward. They drift the way dust floats in a still room, suspended weightless, unhurried. This drifting is the beginning of internal detachment, not from yourself, but from the movement that has defined your inner night until now. You may sense it in the way your awareness feels thinner around the edges, not fading, not disappearing, just loosening its grip on everything it used to hold. Thoughts that once carried meaning now feel like faint shapes passing in the distance. Emotions that once carried tone now feel like distant warmth or shadow. Memories that once felt textured now appear as the softest silhouettes. Nothing is leaving you. It is simply stepping a little farther away. This detachment isn't loss. It is rest. It is the quiet shifting away of anything that still had energy earlier, the mind's remnants, the heart's echoes, the sensitivity that made everything feel close. You might feel your attention wandering through your inner world without purpose. A thought flickers. You register it. It dissolves. An emotion hums softly. You sense it. It fades. A faint impression appears. You notice it. It drifts out of reach. Nothing holds your attention anymore, and nothing wants to. This is the natural way the mind prepares for rest, not through discipline or silence, but through gentle detachment. Your awareness stops gripping things. Your inner world stops presenting things. And the two slowly drift apart, not in separation, but in soft, quiet distance. You may notice that the murmur inside you, the one that accompanied you from the first part of the night, now sounds different, barely audible, barely present, like the last vibration of something that is almost finished resonating. It's not gone. It's simply no longer shaping anything inside you. It exists the way a memory exists when you're almost asleep there, but not asking to be remembered. This is the moment when your interior space becomes wider and lighter at the same time. Wider because nothing is filling it. Lighter because nothing is pressing into it. Your thoughts might feel far away, as if they belong to another version of you. Your emotions might feel quiet, as if they have laid themselves down. Your memories might feel distant, as if they are resting behind a thin veil. You may even feel yourself drifting slightly, not physically, but internally, a gentle floating sensation that comes when your inner world begins letting go of its structure. This drifting is not confusion. It is ease. It is what happens when your mind and heart stop holding themselves upright. You might sense half thoughts appearing quick, faint dissolving almost instantly. They have no intention, no direction, no shape. They're more like impressions than thoughts, like smoke instead of words. You may feel half emotions too, not sadness, not joy, not longing, but something softer and less defined, like a distant warmth or a fading shadow. These are the last movements of the inner world before it enters the quiet where rest begins. The night has carried you through so many layers, the active thoughts that refuse to rest, the deeper patterns beneath them, the emotional weight that rose gently, the tenderness of the heart, the sensitivity that opened slowly, the soft descent into stillness. And now, everything begins to drift away from the center of your awareness, not disappearing, not shutting down, just moving far enough away that you no longer feel the need to follow. You may feel yourself losing interest in your own inner motion. Thoughts pass by, but don't stay. Emotions rise slightly, but don't land. Memory tones appear, but don't anchor. Nothing inside you is trying to be important anymore. This is the quiet separation. The night gently invites the moment when your awareness steps back from everything it felt earlier and allows your inner world to soften without supervision. It's the part of the night where thinking becomes optional, feeling becomes lighter, and presence becomes dim. You might sense your consciousness flattening, becoming wide, thin open, as if it's losing the boundaries that made everything earlier feel close. Or you might feel a gentle heaviness behind your eyes, a soft relaxation of the heart, a slowing of your internal rhythm. This slowing is not sleep. It is pre-sleep. It is the mind letting go of its grip on meaning and slipping into a state where nothing needs to be interpreted. Your awareness becomes more passive. It notices less. It cares less. It holds nothing tightly. You begin drifting toward a place where nothing inside you has sharp edges. Not your thoughts, not your feelings, not your memories, not even your sense of self. Everything becomes gentle floating light. The murmur inside you fades almost entirely here, not silenced, just absorbed into the dim quiet of your inner world, as if the part of you that has been whispering all night is finally ready to rest too. You may sense yourself moving closer to the threshold where awareness loosens, where thought becomes soundless, where emotion becomes texture, where the self becomes soft. A threshold where you no longer hold your inner world, you drift with it. And in that drift, you feel something simple and profound. You are ready for the quiet that comes next. Not sleep yet, but the last gentle letting go before rest begins. There is a final moment in the night, quiet, delicate, almost imperceptible, when the drift inside you completes its slow unfurling. Everything that moved through you over the course of the night, every faint thought, Every soft emotion, every subtle memory, tone, every lingering sensitivity has now lowered itself into a place where nothing rises anymore. Not because anything has disappeared, but because your inner world has entered a depth where movement is no longer necessary. This is not emptiness. It is not silence in the strict sense. It is the gentle completion of your descent into the softest part of yourself, a place where your awareness no longer separates thought from feeling memory, from presence you, from your inner quiet. You may sense it first as a soft folding inward, like a curtain drawing itself across the edges of your awareness, not shutting anything out, but covering everything with a thin layer of dimness. A dimness that is not darkness, just a gentler way of seeing nothing clearly anymore. Your thoughts become indistinct shallow ripples barely touching the surface. Your emotions become weightless, not rising, not falling, just resting. Your memories dissolve into formless hints, present only as a quiet tone in the background. This is the threshold of rest, the place where awareness softens enough to allow the mind and heart to enter their final state before sleep. You might feel your breath deepen without choosing to. You might feel your body settle more heavily into stillness. You might sense that your inner world is no longer something you are observing, but something you are fading into. Not losing yourself, not dissolving, just merging gently with the quiet inside you. The night has carried you through every layer, the noise of early thoughts, the subtle state of exposure, the emotional weight, the tenderness, the drifting, the descent. And now you are here in the softest layer of all the layer, where you no longer think about anything and no longer feel toward anything. You simply exist. You may sense the faintest echo of the familiar murmur, not as sound, not as thought, but as a barely noticeable vibration, the quiet hum of your being settling into a final stillness. Even this hum feels like it is fading outward, as if it has fulfilled its purpose, guiding you through your inner night until everything became soft enough to let go. And now, it too begins to lie down. You might notice that your sense of time begins to loosen here. Moments feel longer and shorter at once. Awareness feels stretched and thinned, as if your perception has stepped back while your deeper self moves forward into quiet. This is the last stage before rest, where the mind no longer drifts and the heart no longer stirs. Everything flattens into stillness. Your inner world becomes broad and gentle, a soft field of awareness, with no figures in it, no shapes, no movement. You feel the warmth of your earlier emotions, but only as a memory of warmth. You feel the faint touch of old shadows, but only as a dim outline. You feel your sensitivity, but only as a quiet openness without any direction. Everything that made you feel deeply earlier has now taken its place in the background, settled, softened quiet. You may sense yourself drifting in and out of this stillness, not because you are losing awareness, but because you are letting go of the need to hold on to it. Letting go of thinking, letting go of sensing, letting go of interpreting, letting go of the inner journey the night carried you through. There's nothing left to process, nothing left to integrate, nothing left to follow. Your mind is ready. Your heart is ready. Your inner world has reached the place where it no longer needs your attention. And in that readiness, you begin to feel the atmosphere inside you become softer still, as if everything is dissolving into a quiet mist. The murmur, now nearly silent, becomes one with this mist. Your awareness, now nearly weightless, floats gently inside it. Your emotions, now nearly textureless, spread into it. What remains is the softest state of being, the moment when your inner world stops being something you witness and becomes something you rest inside. You may feel your breath as soundless presence now. You may feel your heartbeat as distant warmth. You may feel your thoughts as faint glimmers barely forming before they disappear. This is the final softening, the one that comes only after you've descended fully into the quiet space the night prepared for you. The place where nothing pushes, nothing lingers, nothing echoes. You simply float inside yourself, not searching, not thinking, not feeling, just existing, just resting. The night has carried you gently layer by layer until you arrived at this place where your inner world is calm enough for sleep to find you naturally. And in this calm, you understand something softly. Rest is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of movement. Rest is not silence. It is softness. Rest is not escape. It is arrival, the arrival into the quietest part of yourself, the place where you no longer need to hold anything because the night is holding you. Nothing more rises. Nothing more drifts. Nothing more echoes. Everything falls into the quiet, and you too are finally ready to let go.